Now, full disclosure from the start, though I do consider myself a Star Trek fan, I'm more of the casual variety than anything else. For example, I've seen all the Star Trek movies with the original cast and those with the Next Generation cast, but I've only ever seen a handful of episodes from the original Star Trek series that aired back in the 60s, which might sound like blasphemy to some, that I call myself a fan without having seen what started it all. However, to my knowledge, I have seen every single episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. In fact, I loved The Next Generation so much growing up that I caught every single episode as it originally aired, back in the late 80s and up through and into the early to mid 90s. Though back then, and mind you, it started when I was around 9 and ended when I was like 16, I probably couldn't tell you exactly what it was that I actually liked so much, or what drew me in and week out. In fact, it wasn't until years later, when catching reruns whenever I came across them as I was flipping through the channels, that I really began to appreciate what Star Trek The Next Generation was, that being a show that oftentimes explored some really difficult moral and philosophical questions without ever preaching to you or telling you how to think or feel about something. I mean, what's oddly or ironically beautiful about The Next Generation, or the episodes that make up the show, is that they don't always give you a happy ending or outcome, and actually, a lot of the time, it gives you almost a sad ending, or a bittersweet one, or a poignant one, and sometimes it just flat out gives you the worst outcome possible, and ends with a few sad musical notes as we watch the Enterprise drift away to its next mission. And just hearing that, if you've never seen the show, might make you think it's a terrible show and not worth watching, but the thing is, in real life, as you likely long since figured out, not every question or situation or dilemma has an answer or solution that will lead to a happy ending for everyone, or sometimes even for anyone. Sometimes compromises must be made that no one is entirely happy with. Other times there's only the lesser of two evils to choose from, or not even that. Sometimes there's only accepting what must be done, or the only thing that can be done, or accepting the fact that nothing at all can be done. There's also those times when two or more sides will be stubborn, so stubborn that they'd rather see it all burn down and crash to the ground than budge an inch on their beliefs or give ground to the other side. Not that that sounds familiar at all today. And though Star Trek The Next Generation dealt with some insanely difficult questions at times, rarely were they inner conflicts or conflicts amongst the crew. Sure, sometimes crew members would disagree about what solution was best, but one of the ideas behind this show, and Star Trek in general, is that humanity had pretty much figured everything out and gotten over their petty differences. Hell, they'd even come to peace with some of their old enemies like the Klingons. Basically, the show wasn't about humanity trying to figure itself out. It had actually done that already. It was about exploring and trying to figure out and help others in the galaxy without overstepping any boundaries. One of the big things with Star Trek or the Federation was the Prime Directive, or not interfering with developing worlds, which from their point of view was any world that hadn't achieved warp speed yet, any world that wasn't exploring the stars, if you will. Nothing was more important than letting cultures or societies come into their own without outside interference. And so when you step back and look at it, Star Trek The Next Generation was a show that asked you, the viewer, some really tough questions, but never told you what the answer should be. That was always up for you to decide. And yes, of course, there was pretty much always some type of resolution. Plus, the Enterprise crew almost always had their stance on a matter, or what they felt should be done. But the show would always give you the other side in a fair way. And more often than not, the Enterprise crew would respect those they fundamentally disagreed with, which is yet another radical concept in today's world. Basically, the show always made you think instead of telling you how to think, which is what separates it from a lot of modern day shows and movies. And so whenever someone says to me, entertainment has always been political, or that political messages have always been there, I respond by saying, well, yes, but rarely has it ever been so heavy-handed and one-sided. Rarely has entertainment felt like an attempted conversion process, assuming you're of course not someone fully on board with what they're preaching. And look, though it's not that I feel like you can't make a good fictional show or movie that reflects the political landscape of today. In fact, maybe more than ever, we need a show or movie that gives a fair, unbiased overview of what's going on in the world today and gets us to stop and think for a moment. One that doesn't pick sides, but shows how we've basically fallen into two different camps that treat each other like the enemy instead of someone we have to share this world with. Okay, all that said, let's talk a little bit about the first episode of Picard. And do keep in mind, I haven't seen the other new Star Trek show called Discovery, nor did I see the show Enterprise from like 15 years ago now, I want to say, which many told me was a slightly different take on Star Trek. Anyway, let me first say that I actually enjoyed the first episode of Picard for the most part. It had some problems, which I'll get to in a bit, but I thought it was pretty good. I didn't know exactly what to expect going in. I hadn't kept up with the news or seen the trailers or anything like that really. All I'd heard is that Patrick Stewart had said at one point that it would be a reflection of the modern world, that it would deal with such things as Trump and Brexit, which wasn't something I needed to see in my entertainment. I get enough of that elsewhere, and probably wouldn't have watched this first episode if it wasn't for free here on YouTube. Nevertheless, I'm happy to say that at least the first episode seems to be relatively true to the character of Jean-Luc Picard. He's basically the man of principle and integrity I remember him to be, though he's a bit softer, I guess you could say. The Picard I knew would never fall all over himself to protect a girl he'd met 10 seconds ago, even if it was Data's daughter. In fact, the first time Data made a daughter back in the show, Picard was pretty pissed off about that. But I digress, and this feels like an older, a bit softer around the edges Jean-Luc Picard to me. They didn't go the Luke Skywalker route with him and turn him into some bitter old bastard who thinks Starfleet and space exploration needs to end. It's actually the Federation that has changed, and changed greatly. They've become isolationists who turned their back on their old enemy, the Romulans, after their sun exploded, which, yes, is a reference to what we see in the Star Trek reboot movie from J.J. Abrams. Anyway, even though, as I said, I did like this first episode, it didn't really feel like Star Trek to me. Not only has Star Trek always been about exploration, but it's never been about large, overarching, mystery box type stories and plots. And in this first episode, I feel like a new mystery was introduced in damn near every scene, and some of them seem completely random, like the synthetics attacking Mars. What's that all about? When did they even become a race of people? Star Trek The Next Generation, on the other hand, was very episodic in nature. It was the type of show you didn't have to watch each and every week to understand what was going on in it presently. Other than a few to-be-continued episodes, which usually were season finales, you could pick almost any random episode and sit down and enjoy. Yes, there were some loose, overarching plots and reoccurring characters or villains, two of the best, in my opinion, being Q and the Borg, and most of the main characters had their own personal stories that got explored to some extent, or some sort of interesting dynamic to them, like Worf having to deal with being a Klingon in Starfleet, and how his people treated him because of that, or Data's quest to be more like a human. Things like that were always present in the show. But by and large, the characters in the final episode weren't all that much different or hadn't grown or changed all that much from those in the very first episode. And that's not to say the characters were bad, quite the opposite really. Almost all of them were fantastic and portrayed perfectly by the actors. But the show just wasn't about their personal struggles. Again, the idea behind the show is that humanity had gotten their stuff together and were now trying to explore and spread their collective wisdom that they'd achieved to the rest of the galaxy without ever enforcing it, if that makes sense, or ever infringing on the inherent rights of these other societies to govern themselves. Picard, on the other hand, feels a lot like any other action or drama of the day with a sci-fi type setting. Though again, I thought it was pretty good. I'll probably watch more. I don't know that there's anything that really separates it from the crowd. I don't know that there's anything all that unique about it. Granted, I've only seen one episode, and it could get much better, or it could get much worse, I suppose, but right now it doesn't feel like Star Trek. It certainly has a lot of familiar characters, places, lingo, and everything else to try to make it feel like Star Trek, but it's missing the essence or heart or spirit of the franchise. It's missing, I believe, the inspiration that Gene Roddenberry originally instilled in it. And that's another thing, it does borrow heavily from previous Star Trek shows and movies, and if you've never seen anything Star Trek before, good luck understanding some of this. And don't get me wrong, for the most part I do like it when a long-standing property doesn't water everything down for the brand new viewer. But if you are someone completely unfamiliar with this franchise, you're probably going to be lost. I mean, at the end of this first episode, when they pull back and reveal the giant Borg cube, it's a big moment for those who know Star Trek, but if you don't, it's just a giant cube. Impressive in its own right, sure, but you're missing quite a bit. Another thing is this first episode moved at a blistering pace and seemed hell-bent on spawning as many different stories or future plot threads as it could in the time that it had. We're introduced to the daughter of Data, run around with her for 15 minutes, watching her mostly fight and interact with Picard, and then she dies and I guess we're supposed to care. But don't worry, she has a mysterious sister. All the while we're learning about the state of the galaxy, with the Romulans being refugees, and hearing about synthetics attacking Mars, because again, apparently they're a race of people now. And like I said, if you don't know Star Trek, this was probably confusing, yet maybe you're a bit interested and will try to follow along with this show. And if you know it just enough and you're a more casual fan like me, you're probably either intrigued or just apathetic. And if you're a diehard fan, if you're a Trekkie, I guess you're either furious at this show and hate it because it's a huge departure from what Star Trek has always been, or you love it because it's a huge departure from what Star Trek has always been. Sure, Deep Space Nine was also a bit of a departure from the classic formula. It was set on a space station that couldn't go anywhere after all, and then it had the war with the Dominion in the later seasons. It had a larger overarching plot at one point, but it never lost the true nature of Star Trek, at least not in my opinion. Same with Voyager. It had an overarching plot, them trying to just get home, but again, it never lost what made it Star Trek. Picard, however, though again, so far it's been pretty good, it doesn't exactly feel like Star Trek anymore. For that, I fear I'll have to wait for the show The Orville to make its return. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. I hope you enjoyed my little departure from Star Wars, and as I've said, there'll be more videos covering other topics in the future, but I'll still primarily do Star Wars here on this channel. Anyway, have you seen Picard, and if so, what did you think? Either way, let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Trek, I guess. And until next time, thanks for watching.